All right. So, to keep in mind, you only want to use those blemish-free fruit and vegetables. It's the same concept if we were to be freezing them. You don't want to choose anything you're not ready to eat now. So make sure they're blemish-free, they don't have any mold or any other kind of growth on them. And you want them to be as perfect as possible. And only use up-to-date research-based recipes. I know this will be difficult for some of us to accept because my grandma used that recipe, right? Or my great aunt used that recipe, but the research is showing we should avoid using those. And I touched on it briefly last week because of the bacteria growth or the chances of botulism, and we do not want those problems because they can manifest into some severe physical ailments and sometimes even death. So you want to make sure that you're using research-based, up-to-date recipes. And that's not just getting on Google and Googling recipes. Like, you actually have to go to a reputable site such as Mississippi State Extension or the University of Georgia. They have great resources and they are research-based. Even Ball. I know a lot of us like to can using Ball jars. You can use their recipes sometimes. They are pretty darn good. But if you don't feel comfortable using theirs, some of them are not actually research-based. Again, extension is the way to go. And the USDA, of course. So keeping on with the keeping in mind, you want to use pickling salt, high-grade vinegar of 5% acidity, and fresh spices. And we're going to go into why these are so important. And processed pickles, according to the recipe, do not deviate from those instructions. You may be like, oh, that's way too much sugar. That's way too much sodium. Stick to the recipe. Do not change them. It's literally a chemical formula that has been created to prevent you from harming yourself or harming others who are going to be consuming these canned goods. Processed pickles, according to the recipe, do not deviate from the instructions, okay? Do not deviate from those instructions. All right, I'm gonna move on now. I just wanna make sure I'm driving that home. And after you can them, I know you wanna show them off because they're absolutely beautiful, but store them in a cool and dark, dry space, okay? Put them somewhere where they're not gonna be being exposed to too much sunlight. Even though they'll look beautiful on your countertop when the sun hits it just right, you want to store those in cool, dark, dry places. Okay, so now we're going to move on to those ingredients. All right, so you want to choose ingredients specific to pickling. I'm not sure where these red marks are coming from on my screen. I don't know if you can see them or not. So cucumbers should be pickling cucumbers. Don't go to the grocery store and get those waxy cucumbers, okay? Those are not pickling cucumbers. They have so much wax on them that they will not be suitable for pickling. The acid will not preserve them as it should, so you do not want to go to the grocery store and just say, hey, let's do some pickling today and choose those waxy cucumbers. Choose cucumbers that are specific for pickling. And remove and discard at least 1/16 of an inch of the blossom of your fresh cucumbers. And if you do happen to purchase them from a farmer's market or someone gives them to you, you're going to remove that blossom, okay? You're going to remove that end of it. And the reason being is not only because sometimes the soil can get stuck up in that area, but because there's an enzyme in it that will cause your pickles to soften. And I don't know about you, but I do not like soft pickles. I want them to be crunchy, not soft. Okay, so next you want to select fresh fruit and vegetables, again, that are blemish-free with no signs of mold or decay, because if they do have a sign of mold or decay, they may have some form of bacteria that can be harmful to you that may not be destroyed during the processing period, okay? So you want to make sure that they're blemish free. And plan to pickle your fruit or your vegetables within 24 hours of being harvested. It's almost just like the freezing your fruit and your vegetables. You want to pick those items, harvest them, and plan to preserve them soon thereafter. The sooner you do it, the fresher and the better your product will be once it's finished. Because again, if you're trying to process something that looks wrinkled, something that looks like it's almost getting ready to be thrown out, you don't want to process those things, because that's exactly what you're going to get whenever you process them. You're going to get something that still needs to be thrown out. So this is not a way to save your vegetables and your fruit. This is a way to preserve them. You want to preserve them in the state that they are. Use pickling salt. I know in the past, growing up from experience, my mom used to pickle things and she would use like regular table salt. And the thing, they didn't turn out well. They would be extremely murky looking. And sometimes they just did not seal. And now that I understand pickling more, it's because she was not using pickling salt. And iodized salt, do not use that. You want to use pickling salt. And you can get that from your grocery store or maybe even a feed store. They may have some. And the shelf life of pickling salt is easily 2 years or plus. And you can just look at it and see the quality of it. But it should last for a pretty good while. But you want to use pickling salt, not iodized salt and not just your regular table salt. You want to use pickling salt, okay? And using a high-grade cider or white distilled vinegar of 5% acidity. And that is important because that's what we're doing. We are acidifying this food so that it can be preserved. If we don't acidify it to the right level of acidity, we risk the bacterial development that can again lead to botulism. And that's something we're trying to avoid. We don't want any foodborne illnesses at all. But you want to make sure that you're using a high-grade cider or white distilled vinegar. That's the best way to get there. All right, so spices lose their flavor. So if you want to have some delicious pickles, make sure you're using fresh spices. The fresher, the better. And you can, in some of the recipes you'll find, they will oftentimes use one of those cloths that you can tie the spice in and drop it in while you're cooking your liquid or your brine or whatever you're going to be cooking your pickles in or the liquid in before you start the canning process. That's what you're going to put your spices in. And if you just want to put them directly into that liquid or whatever solution or recipe you're using, that's fine as long as you strain it all off before you place your pickles in that jar and that liquid in there as well, because you don't want any remnants of those spices to go in. Again, you want to try to strain it as much as possible. And reason being is you want your product to be the best product. You don't want to waste your time or waste your dollars by messing it up, okay? All right, so now avoid using hard water during fermentation or quick pickling. Hard water can be treated if you just boil it for 15 minutes. You're gonna cover it up and you're gonna leave it sitting for 24 hours. And if afterwards there's something on the top, you'll just skim that top off and slowly pour your water into whatever container you're going to be using. And you want to do it slowly so that you're not disturbing that sediment that's at the bottom of the pan or the pot. in the event that there is some. And if you want to take the easy route, you can just go to your local market or your dollar store or whatever and get some distilled water. And pickling liquids should be heated in stainless steel, aluminum, glass, or unchipped enamelware saucepans. Do not use copper, brass, galvanized, or iron utensils. Remember, we went over this last time as well, because if you're using those copper, brass, galvanized utensils, you have the risk of a chemical reaction happening between that acid and those utensils. And in the event that that does happen, you have to discard everything. All of everything that you've already processed, you'll have to throw it away. And how sad would that be? All your hard work, all those fresh ingredients, they would be useless. So if you would just keep in mind that you want to be sure to use stainless steel, aluminum, glass, or unchipped enamelware. All right, so now for the fun part, preparing jars and lids. Okay, now how many of you have reused your lids time and time again? You're like, hey, there's no rust. I'm gonna keep using this lid over and over again. And I'm not talking about the ring that seals the lid onto the jar. I'm talking about the lid itself. Okay, I've seen it happen before. Do not reuse those lids. They are only to be used once. However, the rings, as long as they don't have any dents or rust on them, you can use those until they start to develop rust or there's visible damage there. But you have to purchase new lids every time that you're going to can something. Do not reuse those lids, okay? All right, so closely examine. I don't even want to say lids right now, the rings. Closely examine your rings and your jars. Make sure they don't have any cracks, any rough edges, any nicks on them, because if they do, something can happen during that processing. And again, all your product will be gone. And not just that, there is always the possibility of bacteria growth. So you want to make sure that your cans and your rings that are going to go along around that jar and over that lid to seal it, that they are defect free. And make sure you're using new lids, okay? And jars should be washed with soapy water, rinsed and kept hot. I know again, and this is whenever we get caught up in traditionalism. My grandma did it, so that's how I'm gonna do it. And we'll use those we'll wash the jars and just sit them out, and they're getting cool. Some of them have gotten cold because the cold air is blowing directly on them. So when it's time for us to start putting our food and our liquid inside of the jars and then putting them directly inside of our boiling water, they can break because of the difference in the temperature. So make sure you're keeping your jars hot. And a recipe that requires jars to be processed less than 10 minutes, they need to be sterilized. And you can do this by easily boiling those jars for 10 minutes. But either way, you have to keep them hot. After you have sterilized them, you still have to keep them ready to be used, okay? You have to keep them hot. And when using lids, follow the manufacturer's directions. And again, do not reuse your lids. They are one time only. I know they look good. There's nothing wrong with it. I can't see anything wrong with it, but guess what? You can't actually see the bacteria, so throw those babies away. Lid rings, of course, again, they can be reused as long as you don't see any defects with them. All right, so now we're moving on to processing. The act of processing, fermentation, or direct application of acid is necessary to prevent microbial growth. And that is exactly what we're trying to do. We're not just preserving them because they're not going to spoil. We're preserving them so the bacteria that grows that causes the spoilage is slowed down. It's not that it's not going to happen. It's just slowed down because you can't keep your canned goods forever. And I know some of y'all are thinking, yes, you can. I still got some of my grandma canned goods. Well, I implore you, do not eat them, especially if they have an odor when you open them or they're slimy or something. But the reason why we are preserving them is, of course, in the name, is to preserve the life of them, the shelf life of that product. We're slowing down the growth of bacteria. All right, so following the acidification process, spoilage can be prevented by refrigeration or canning. And in this instance, today, I'm touching a lot on the canning aspect because I want to make sure we're doing the best that we can, not to cause a foodborne illness, because that's all it is. When you hear people talking about botulism or any other illness that is related to canning, that's just foodborne illness, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So refrigeration of properly processed foods can last up to 6 months, and those are your fermented foods. That's when you're talking about the production of lactic acid, and of course your long brine deals. But if you're just doing something like one of those fast fresh packs, that's not going to last you up to 6 months, maybe a couple weeks, but not 6 months. Canning is the recommended method and the only method procedure for fresh packed pickles. All right, so moving on to our boiling water bath. All you need to can is a large enough metal container, pot, we like to call it, and a lid that can cover it securely. Tight fitting lid, not something that's going to be easily moved where the air get out of it and it'll just ruin the process. But you want to have a pot with a secure lid, okay? As long as those cans can fit in there and enough water to cover them, you can use that to can. And it must have a rack at the bottom so that you can sit your jars on, because you can't sit them directly at the bottom. You have to have a rack. And the diameter of the canner should not exceed 4 inches more than the diameter of the stove's burner, because you want it to heat equally. Because again, imagine you're a scientist. You're a kitchen scientist. That's what you are. You're trying to get these canned goods together without causing anyone any harm. So you have to make sure everything is up to par and you're following those directions as best as possible. So you're going to fill your canner halfway with hot water and place a burn to heat to 140 degrees for raw packed food and 180 degrees for hot packed foods. And you're boiling water in a separate pot. Now, the reason why you're going to boil your water in a separate pot, and this has happened to me, I don't want this to happen to you. If you don't boil extra water in another pot, there is the chance that once you put your jars in your pot and the water level starts to rise, that it will not cover your jars an inch or 2 inches. It'll be too low and it will be horrible. And I say horrible, but it wastes a lot of time during this processing period if you have to add water out of the sink to your pot, because that lowers the temperature of your water. And then you have to wait for the boil to start back up. So if you have water already boiling in another pot, that'll save you a lot of time and a headache. Okay, so again, we are following the recipe directions for the pack for our fruit or our vegetables. And we're being sure to leave headspace. And when we're talking about pickling, that headspace is usually a half of an inch. And headspace is important because if you pack I've seen it time and time again, when people submit canned goods to the fair for judging, they will have zero headspace. And that's dangerous because if the food gets caught under the seal during the canning process, again, we have the risk of botulism. So we have to make sure, and for it to seal properly, of course, so you have to make sure you're leaving enough headspace. And again, when you're pickling, that's usually a half of an inch. But if you're following a recipe, just follow the guidelines and instructions for that recipe, and they'll give you the exact amount of headspace for that recipe and for a particular size jar. So use plastic or rubber utensils to release trapped air. And by trapped air, I'm talking about those bubbles that form along the edges once you've put your product inside of that jar. So after that's finished, you can go along with that utensil. And if Ball has an awesome pack that has everything that you need in it, including that plastic spatula that you can use to go along the edges to release that trapped air. So using a jar lifter, which would also come in one of those packs, you can place prepared jars onto the rack inside of the canner. And it's very useful when you're removing the jars from the canner as well, because no one wants to put their hand in some hot water. And if needed, add more boiling water to the canner to ensure your jars are covered with at least 1 inch of water. And you want to add the water between the jars and not on top of the jars, okay? And that's why we want to keep that water boiling in a separate pot, because if you're using a recipe that requires a long boil period, it's a high chance that that water is going to start to decrease, the level is, and you're going to have to add more water because it has to stay at least 1 inch above those jars the entire time. If not, you have to restart the entire process. I kid you not, you'll have to start it all the way over again. So you want to make sure that you have at least 1 inch of water over your jars the entire process. And set heat to its highest setting and cover with a lid. And your time starts, the processing time starts once you have a boil and you cover your pot with a lid. That's when the timer starts. So don't think as soon as you're putting your jars inside of the canner that, hey, I can start my timer. No, your timer does not start until you have a full, vigorous boil going on. And remember, you want to keep your water at least 1 inch above your jars. Sometimes processing cucumbers, pickles, in simmering water at 180 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes results in crispier pickles. And as I stated, I love crispy pickles. So that would be a method. If you like crispy pickles, that would be a great method for you to try. And if you see here are just some instructions for you. And do not use this method for reduced sodium pickles. If you would like to have a recipe for reduced sodium pickles, you research a recipe specific for reduced sodium pickles. Don't take away from the recipe that you're following. You want to follow these recipes. Don't add and don't take away. Once processing time is complete, you'll remove the lid from the canner and allow it to sit for 5 minutes. Prepare surface to place your canned jars. And whenever we're getting somewhere to put our jars, make sure it's not an area that has air blowing directly on it because you want them to cool off real fast, if you do that, you're risking the chances that your jar can crack, that it can burst. So sit it in an area where there is no direct sunlight and where there is no direct air blowing on those jars. And you're going to use a jar lifter to remove those safely from the canner. And I couldn't think of anything better to remove these with than these jar. I'm telling you, these things are so convenient. If you don't have one, please invest in one. And you're going to place your jars without tilting onto your prepared surface. Again, avoid placing jars in cold drafts and insulating them with towels. They don't need any insulation, okay? You're just going to allow them to cool. Don't try to do too much. Sometimes we hurt ourselves because we think we need to do more, and it doesn't require more. So just follow the directions, okay? All right, and now you're gonna allow your jars to sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. No matter how antsy you get, don't go over there and start shaking your jars up. Don't go over there and start turning them upside down, praying that they seal properly. Just follow the directions. All right, and that's all I have right now, so we will go